Well, happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody. I was talking to Beth before we got started. I'm not sure how many people still are trying to wear green so they don't get pinched today. Anybody else wear green? My wife made sure I wore socks today that were green so that none of my students came up and pinched me either while I'm up here or afterwards. But glad to be with you all this morning. I'm Josiah. I go by Cy, and I get to serve our middle schoolers and their families. And it's been a joy to serve you all for the past almost over 3 years. Our family has been growing and been in zone defense, really, over the past several years. Right, we've moved from man-to-man to zone defense. As my wife, Grace, and our three, Liliana, Jedediah, and Selah. I feel like I've gotten there as a dad, right? Once you get to 3, and I have to handle them all by myself for a couple hours and keep them alive, I feel like I make it when that happens, right? You keep them all there, they're okay. You're changing a diaper, and then the other ones are careening around the house or crying. You're like, oh, I've made it. My patience runs out in the hour, but I've made it as a dad at that point, right? And it gets me wondering, how do you know when you've made it in life? Whether that's as a parent, as a boss, as a business owner, or anything. How do you know you've made it? How do you know if you're successful enough? How do you know if you're famous enough or if your level of prosperity is at the right level? Is there a top? When's the payoff coming for when you finally made all the work come back to pay you? Take Taylor Swift, for example. Bear with me, okay? All right, I know not all our Swifties are here in the room today. How do you know? Right? And even in her 2019 documentary, Miss Americana, you get the sense that enough wasn't enough. When her album Reputation didn't get nominated at the Grammys, she said, I'll just make a better record. Winning previously wasn't enough. And even in her most recent Eras tour, she's had all sorts of shattering records. Her concerts boosted local economies, crashed Ticketmaster, netted huge profits for Etsy bracelet makers. For those of you that go, you know what that means. And solidified herself as the second richest woman in music. Yet even at her most recent Grammy win, she pushed her next album. There's always something else. When has she made it? When is enough enough? When do you know that you've made it? How do you know? When is the payoff coming? In our text today, we're hopefully challenged on where our prosperity and our payoff align. So please open up to Genesis 40. It'll be on page 33 of the Pew Bible there in front of you. We are back into our Genesis narratives that we've been covering here and there. We're back into Genesis, and we're picking up with Joseph yet again. Remember, his story started in Genesis 37, and then we get this weird YouTube ad in Genesis 38 of Judah and Tamar. And then we follow Joseph after that from 39 through the end of the chapter. But remember, Genesis doesn't start with Joseph. It starts way beforehand. And in Genesis 3, we get the promised snake crusher. And so we see Abraham called, and this people is given a promise. God is going to work through this line of people, and they're promised a name and a blessing and land, all these different things. And so as we go through this narrative, we're to pay attention to this generation, to these people that God is working through. And the word link we're given is that these are the generations of, and then it goes through the line, and then it sometimes gives stories. And that's the pattern throughout Genesis. And in Genesis 37, we see these are the generations of Jacob, right, who's renamed Israel, who's God's chosen people. Remember, it's his people at Mount Sinai that are receiving the Torah from Moses, right? That's when they're receiving this. And so when they're there, they either recalling this from memory or they're hearing it from the first time. And so we too are to keep the whole picture of Genesis in mind. How will this generation turn out? Is this snake crusher coming through them? Will God protect his people? When will they make it? When is the payoff coming for all this that God has brought them through? Chapter 39, we see Joseph in the downward spiral of his life. Yet we see, as Pastor Dan showed us, that the Lord was with Joseph. He was with Joseph at the beginning when he was purchased into slavery and at the end when he's put in prison. And that's where we find ourselves here today. Here in 40 and 41, we're going to cover both of them today. This is his major dream sequence. A dream got him into this mess. It's a dream going to get him out. In chapter 40, it starts out hopeful since we know God was with him as he brought him some prosperity in the prison, in the jail. He's raised to leadership even there. Yet, as in 39, we'll see 40, he ends more hopeless than at the beginning. But look briefly with me at this little snippet. We're going to start in Genesis 40, 1 through verse 8, as we start to unpack this long narrative together. Genesis 40, 1 through 8. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody, and one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." Joseph is leading in the prison, and these officials are brought under his care. And many of you are familiar with this story, but we start to see a pattern emerge even here. Right? We see the dream first occur, and we see that happen to both of these people. And they have the same response. They're both troubled. The reason is there's no one to interpret, right? They're in prison. They don't get this type of luxury to have someone to interpret, right? They had no one there, yet Joseph is then presented as the answer. And right away, he points to God as their solution. And then the dreams are told and then interpreted, and then we see the dreams come true. And many of you are familiar with the dreams here, but there's the cupbearer's dream, who has the 3-branched vine from which he used to serve the Pharaoh, which represents him being lifted up back to his position and being restored. And then the baker's dream is very similar, but with a slight difference. The 3 cake baskets on his head being plucked by birds point to his head also being lifted up, but in a literal way. And so his end is death, the other to life, both looking to the future. Now remember, dreams were very important to the Egyptian culture. They valued them, they saw them as a connection to the supernatural world, but they believed you need an expert. Dreams were a source of knowledge and wisdom from the world beyond. For the Egyptians here in this passage, that's clearly the focus of this text is the dreams. But the dreams aren't the focus for God and his man, Joseph. And so here, right on this section, we see faithfulness in prison by Joseph. We see faithfulness in prison. Look at his responses with me. As you see right there in the midst of those dreams, he makes a plea to be remembered. Yet at the very end of 40, he's in a worse place than he began, right? Verse 23 says, the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. In Andrew Lloyd Webber's Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, for those of you, maybe you've seen it or maybe heard about it, right? The performance. It's at this time where the narrator pops in, he's in jail, right? He's like, hey, it's okay, I've read the book and you come out on top. But we know that's not what happens. And although we've read the book and we know Joseph comes out on top, at this point, Joseph doesn't get any sense of that being the case. God doesn't pop into his cell and read him Romans 8:28. That wasn't even written yet, but we actually see at the beginning of 41 that he's there for 2 more years. It wasn't just another week or so. He's probably waking up every day wondering, maybe he did tell him and he didn't really want to bring me back out. Or every day wondering what God was going to do. Is he going to get out of this prison? 2 years. It's a long time. Waiting, forgotten, in jail. It makes you wonder what else is wanted of this man. He's been abused and sold by his brothers. Potiphar's wife falsely accused him. The cupbearer forgets him. Even though the cupbearer is lifted up, Joseph is left out, forgotten. He's demonstrated faithfulness. He's demonstrated faithfulness in temptation. He's demonstrated his desire to follow God, even though he's been totally taken off track. This isn't the first time as well that we see this pattern of him being raised and him ending up lower, right? He was raised as chief steward in Potiphar's household, only to be thrown in jail. Raised to trusted leadership in prison, only to be forgotten. Why would God allow this to happen again to Joseph? Hasn't he done his time? He's already been faithful. Is God really still with Joseph? As we read this morning from Psalm 23, we can feel a similar status in our own life, of feeling in the valley and feeling in the prison. Can you imagine the temptation for Joseph to be resentful, angry, cynical, and depressed? I don't know about you guys, but I get pretty annoyed when crumble cookie doesn't have the flavor that I was looking forward to that week, and they run out by the time I get there. But 2 years, not just of letting life go by, but being stuck in the prison. We all have asked the question, why does God allow this to happen to me? And why now? Why the loss of job or demotion? Why the marital issues now? Why the loss of friends? Why the cancer or the sickness now? I'd like to be the narrator that pops into your life and says, it's okay, I've read your book. You turn out okay. But God doesn't promise us the worldly prosperity, even though we may see Joseph's story end up that way. What we are promised, as we just sang, is that God is with us. And many times, it's in that prison experience that we learn that truth of God's presence in the most potent way. The question I was asking myself, and we can ask ourselves this week, is what does it look like for me to demonstrate faithfulness in the prison? What do you do when you're at the end of yourself? Life situations have stretched you to the end. Faithfulness is doing the next right thing. Faithfulness doesn't give in to self-indulgence, whether that's sexual, whether that's living through our anger, or whether that's self-pleasure, self-promotion at the harm of others, or whether that's self-medication to drown out our prison experience. Our relationship with God is not simplified to the end result of our life. It includes the process of faithfulness by which we get there. Faithfulness is faithfulness, regardless of the scale or the context that God chooses to use it. And for Joseph, there was more to be learned in prison. He had to be raised, not of his own doing, but of God. He was God's chosen man, just like those before him of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He had to be chosen, and he was not self-made. He was God's man because God chose him and placed him there. In 39 and in 40, we get the assurance that God was with Joseph. And as we head into 41, we don't see that phrase again. But we actually see the clearest picture that God was with Joseph. We're going to jump down into 41 verse 8. So if you're following along with me, look at 41 verse 8. We see Pharaoh have the dreams in the first several of verses. And then we get to see a similar pattern begin to emerge. And so I think we can see it here starting in this verse, 41 verse 8. So he has the dream, and then in the morning his spirit was troubled. There's that word again. And he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. We start to see that similar pattern, right? We get the dream, one about life and one about death, both looking to the future. We see that he is troubled. It makes sense for the prisoners. They don't have access to an interpreter. But even the most powerful in Egypt, with all the access that he has, still has no one to interpret. which is where God brings in Joseph. And now at this point, he's probably feeling a mix of emotions, right? A little frustrated. How do you forget the guy who changes your life and gets you out of prison? Like, how do you forget that, right? Probably a little annoyed at this point, a little frustrated, angry. It's like, oh, why I've been in this position? But he's also probably a little excited, right? That this is his opportunity. This is his chance. It's not given to him on a silver platter. He still has to interpret, which could lead to his own head being lifted off. But it's on the heels of what seems like he's been forgotten by God and the world. This is when God meets him, and God uses him and orchestrates his life for this. He's presented, Joseph, and he still points to God, right? We see this pattern as he continues to do this. We have the dream told to him, then the dream is interpreted, and we see a slight difference. That's why the asterisk is there. And then we see him do a proposal that leads to promotion, and then we see the dream occurs. A similar pattern, but a couple of differences here, right? When he interprets the dream, many of you know the story. Many of you heard these before, right? We have the cows and the wheat, right? The 7 years representing the 7 good years, the 7 bad years. The Nile is representing the whole nation as a helpless state that they're going to be in the famine, representing how as a leader, but also how as Egypt itself is going to go through this time. But throughout all this, 3 separate times in his interpretation, he points to God. Look down at them with me in 16. That's where he starts out and points to God in the first place. It's a similar comment that he makes to the cupbearer and the baker. He says in verse 16, "It is not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." The word favorable there is actually shalom, so it means more complete and whole, not necessarily a positive response. He's saying, hey, God's going to give you the complete answer. It's coming from him. And then in 25, he says, God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. Again, pointing to God's sovereignty. Verse 28, something very similar. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. And then verse 32, the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. He doesn't just give him this interpretation pointing to God's sovereignty. He actually gives a proposal as well. He goes beyond just what Pharaoh asked and implements wisdom, as we see, that leads to his promotion. So we've seen his faithfulness in prison, and now we're seeing his faithfulness in prosperity. He doesn't shy away from pointing to the divine origins of what he's received, the wisdom that he has. God was the one that kept him in prison and the one that brought him out at the right time on Pharaoh's birthday, nonetheless. God is the one that has been orchestrating his life, but it's not just for Joseph's benefit. We actually see Pharaoh recognize this. If you're following along, right, in 38 and 39, we see him recognize this. We say, who else has the Spirit of God like this? And he says, because of what God has revealed to you, I want to put you over everything. He doesn't fully understand the God of Israel in this moment, but he does see the divine origin of what Joseph has been doing. Joseph doesn't use this moment to slam the cupbearer or to point to himself. He still remains faithful in prosperity, and he points to God's sovereignty. So what does it look like for you and me to demonstrate faithfulness in prosperity? How often are we readily pointing to God at work in our lives? Whether it's with people that we know, with one another, but also when it's a little more difficult, when it's people that maybe don't understand the God that we worship and follow. That's a great opportunity as a bridge to the gospel. But what about those times when maybe we're tempted to point to ourselves and our own glory? Well, it's the interview after the game, the applause after the performance, the promotion at work, or any success that we have in life where we start to think, I've made it. Our life lived for God includes the process of faithfulness in every season. Is there an area of your life that God has blessed you to be faithful? The Moravec's principle, which is often used with robotics, points to the idea that the easy or simple things are in fact the hard things. In robotics, such as the Tesla robot or Atlas, right, it is much easier to make a robot do a backflip than it is to say, take a seat, sit down on a chair. Something simple that all of us have done today multiple times without even thinking. But it can do a backflip, which probably none of us have done this morning. The simple can be the hard thing to do. And oftentimes we assume if someone is able to do something grandiose, then they can do something far simpler. Yet the simple act of faithfulness, which doesn't always require much, can certainly become the hardest choice we face. Everything in Joseph's past was leading up to this moment. Right? If he hadn't been sold into slavery, he wouldn't have ended up in Egypt. If he hadn't been purchased by Potiphar, he wouldn't have learned some management and leadership skills. If he hadn't been falsely accused, then he wouldn't have been in the prison to be able to interpret the cupbearer's dream. And if he hadn't correctly interpreted that and he hadn't been in the right time, the cupbearer was there 2 years later on the birthday of Pharaoh when he had these dreams, then he wouldn't have been called in at the right moment, at the right time for God to continue to work. The dreams themselves aren't the focus. They were used to present Joseph. Even these dreams serve the larger dream that Joseph had when he was a kid, right? The dream of his rule. And these dreams are the vehicle for the unique sovereignty of God displayed through this man, Joseph. In other words, God displays his sovereign wisdom by orchestrating the faithful life of Joseph to save the world. This story announces the free, sovereign God at work, even in the center of pagan Egyptian existence. God's sovereignty and wisdom has the capacity to work newness against every human existence, no matter the status. After a life of God's presence amidst pit to Potiphar and prison, amidst demonstrated faithfulness and false failure and forgottenness, Joseph's life shows the intersection of God's sovereignty and human faith. God's sovereignty and control doesn't mean that we lay aside as passive pawns, but that we remain responsive and faithful to God's plan. This requires wisdom. This requires seeking the Lord, listening to his Spirit at work in our lives. Man, Joseph has made it, hasn't he? This is it. He's got it all. Right? He finally gets the promotion. Look with me quickly, 41, 39 through 40, right? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all of this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards to the throne will I be greater than you. Not sure if he's making as much as the second richest woman in music, but that's pretty good after being in prison. Being second in command. Pit to Potiphar, to prison, to Pharaoh, to proposal, to promotion. We just need another P in there, right? He made it. He's got all the trappings of Egyptian prosperity, right? Right after our section there, you can follow along there. Right? He's got the signet ring, right? That's doing business on behalf of the Pharaoh, right? He's got the garments of fine linen and gold chain, right? Showing that he is of this high office. The second chariot, it's like a limousine showing, wow, that guy's got something going on, right? And they're shouting before him. Every knee should bow before him. They know who he is when he travels. He's got an Egyptian name, an Egyptian wife, seating him in one of the most powerful priestly families in Egypt. He's made it. This is it, right? Yet when the Israelites, when God's people hear this, they're not cheering. And neither is Joseph. 46 through 57, we get this conclusion to this dream sequence. We see the dream interpretation come to pass. And amidst this is an interesting response of Joseph. Go ahead and read this final section with me as we start to unpack the rest of this narrative. Verses 46 of chapter 41. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it, and Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for, he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph had said, there was famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph, what he says to you, do. So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. God used Joseph to save the world. Yet amidst the years of success, so much that they stopped counting. That's a lot. Joseph has 2 sons. And it doesn't seem like he's acting like this is his pinnacle moment. He gave them, first off, 2 Hebrew names, which will stand out against all of his Egyptian trappings. He names them very interestingly, and they tells us the reasoning, why he named him that way. Manasseh, sounding like forgetful, means, as he says, that God has made me forget all my hardship in my father's house. He's like, okay, I've been able to move on from that, which if you name your kid that, I don't think you actually will forget it, but is that idea, right? He's like, there's been a lot that I've had to move on from. And then Ephraim, he says, means for this reason, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Egypt wasn't the land of hope and future for him. We often get to this and think it's the payoff moment. Finally, he's getting all he deserves, right? Wow, he's been faithful with even a little bit here and there. He's been a good steward, and he has, and now God is rewarding him because of all that. But God's people aren't in charge. What about the other dream that he had? What about God's people, this line that he was protecting, this promised snake crusher? Right? Was God going to use this guy, this great character that we have? He could be the closest person to being the snake crusher, but he actually gets stolen from God's people and put in a pagan nation. Is now this pagan nation going to be the one to bless the world and through him? And is God forgetting his people? Is he with us still? Prosperity often blinds, or even today, right? How much of us do we want pagan prosperity for our kids? But even in prosperity, Joseph had his perspective on the rescue and redemption of God. Joseph gets forgotten in prison, but we know that's not the end. Joseph feels forgetful in this prosperity, but we know that's not the end. God rescued Joseph to rescue his people, to rescue us. God displays his sovereign wisdom by orchestrating the faithful life of Jesus to save the world. Many years later, another would come in a lowly stable, who would then go to the lower state of death to then be raised to life and ruling at the right hand of the Father. On him we see the Spirit of God. As we read this morning in 1 Corinthians 1, he is the wisdom of God. He would also stand before another ruler and reveal the truth of God himself. Jesus is exalted after and through humiliation. His own brothers eventually realize who he is. He tells of what God will do in the future, and surely it will happen. He is the instrument God uses at the hands of pagans to save the world. And he would be the one that every knee should bow in heaven and on the earth and under the earth, and every tongue that confesses that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Jesus is the faithful one we look to today. The world was blessed through Joseph, which we'll see actually more in the next couple chapters of Genesis. But God's promises still weren't complete. There was further blessing to the world in Jesus. God displays his sovereign wisdom by orchestrating the faithful life of Jesus to save the world. Anyone feeling troubled today or anxious? Although we may not have the same view as dreams or of dreams that the Egyptians had, we also are troubled about the future and about what will happen. The powerless in prison, all the way to the most powerful one in Egypt, found themselves troubled about the future, and we're no different. Anxiety is at its all-time high, especially in students. They're being bred into a sea of anxiety and uncertainty. This experience isn't unfamiliar to us. We all end up troubled, and ultimately it's because the future doesn't belong to us. But through the faithful life of Joseph, we see a wise and sovereign God who alone knows the future. God works through our faithfulness today as well. We aren't encouraged to seek out dream interpretations or even worldly prosperity that Joseph ends up receiving, but we are encouraged to seek the same God. The same God that gives his Spirit to those that are already saved by the faithful Jesus. That's how we find prosperity in life, is through Christ. Not the kind of prosperity the world promises, but the prosperity of Christ. Zhang Sung was a missionary to China and Southeast Asia, which many would eventually estimate that over 100,000 people would come to faith from his gospel efforts. Yet his life was full of back and forth moments of success and drawbacks. And one such drawback was the time he spent in an insane asylum because of his faith. The experience was as close to prison as it gets. And instead of being overtaken and defining his life by anxious despair and resentful anger, he recounts his time with these words. The Lord gave me a long-term rest and allowed me to go through many trials and suffering. During that period of time, I could not help but be downcast. But as I look back now, it was all the grace of God. Thanks be to God. He put me in a cold hospital, a solitary place where I led a lifeless and lonely life so that I could and would draw near to God. Because of his great love, he put me in a situation where I would gain many precious insights I would not have been able to gain otherwise. Though the sufferings of my trials are beyond the description of words, my advancement in the Spirit during this period of time is also beyond the descriptions of words. Therefore, brothers and sisters, be prepared for suffering and follow the example of our Lord. Many attribute him saying, faith is watching God work while you are on your knees. May we too demonstrate faith in the prison, faith in prosperity, and faith in God's man, Jesus Christ, who displays his sovereign wisdom by orchestrating the faithful life of Jesus to save the world. Will you pray with me? Father, we thank you for your faithfulness to us, that you chase after us in our sin and in our mess. God, we thank you that whatever season we can find ourselves in, we know we can turn to you, a God who is faithful. We know that we need you, and as we sing about that truth in a moment, God, I pray for those of us in this room that need you right now. Maybe it's for the first time that they need you, or maybe it's for the thousandth time. God, we all cry out in our need to you. We thank you that you do save us. You save us through your Son, Jesus Christ. You don't leave us alone. You promise to be with us. We thank you that you are sovereign and you are wise. No matter what human leaders are in control, no matter what experiences happen in our life, we know you are sovereign and we trust you. In your wonderful name we pray. Amen.